Well, shalom and good evening. This is Derek Leman, and welcome to class number 3 on the Theophanies of the Hebrew Bible. And this is our second week in Genesis 18. We'll be spending at least 4 weeks in Genesis 18 because there's so much here for us to look at. And I have to say, the Hebrew tonight, a couple of things about it. There's some challenging but very interesting Hebrew tonight. I'm not sure that we're going to actually be able to get through all of the verses. I don't want class to go on too long, so if it takes a little longer than I expected to explain it, we may cut off before we get through the whole passage. What I planned for us to discuss tonight was Genesis 18, 9 through 16. And sometimes 8 verses in narrative aren't very hard to translate. There are some challenging verses tonight, a lot of interesting features of the Hebrews, so we may not get quite through all of that. Also, as you're going to see in a minute, when I read the passage, there are a lot of gutturals in tonight's passage. And so the pronunciation of the Hebrew, it's almost funny how difficult it is to pronounce the Hebrew in our passage tonight. I may stumble and stutter over it a little bit myself. We'll see. And there's also kind of a mystery, a suspense that builds in the passage tonight. And I pointed out, for any of you who follow me on Facebook, I pointed out that the narrative keeps silent about who one of the visitors is, of the 3 visitors to Abraham, until verse 13. But some Bible translations give it away earlier. And in places where it just says, and he said, these Bible translations will say, and the Lord said. So they're kind of violating the suspense quality of the story and giving away the answer a little bit too soon. And I think you miss something when you do that. Another thing I notice about the passage tonight, and I'll try to comment on it when we come to a place where I particularly think this is true, when you take the time to read something very slowly because you're translating it from another language, you as a reader pick up on things that you might not notice if you're just reading in a hurry through an English Bible. Now, the truth is, you could translate from any language. You could just pick up a Spanish Bible, and if you know Spanish, translate a Bible passage. And the fact that you have to translate it from a language that's not your native language to another one makes you read it slowly. You could be translating Spanish or German or Russian or any language and have that experience. But all the better if you're actually translating from the language it was written in, because then the things that you notice as you read through the passage are more certain and more true to the original meaning of the text. And I know that as a reader, I picked up on some things in translating this passage that I didn't notice before in just reading the English Bible. Well, that was a lot of preface, I know. And I have just one more thing to say before I really get into the material. And that is, I'm not going to be able to participate in the live chat with those of you who are here tonight. There's just a problem and I couldn't log in. And so I'm basically just talking to a computer right now, and I don't have any way to communicate with people who are in the class. So unfortunately, I don't have a way to take questions tonight. We will get that fixed before next week. Okay, before I read, and again, we're looking at Genesis 18, verses 9 through 16. And before I read that, I'd like to open with a word of prayer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav, v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, O Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us to busy ourselves with the words of the Torah. And as we busy ourselves with Genesis 18, I pray that the mystery of God appearing on earth would mean a great deal to us, and that we would learn something from this theophany. This very significant theophany, it seems to me, where you appeared as a man to Abraham. And help us to just be in wonder about the possibility, God, of you showing up on earth, of you doing things on earth, of us seeing your hand in a mighty and a more tangible way. May it be so, I pray, in Yeshua's name. Amen. And Abraham certainly had amazing encounters with God. And this story that we're translating is among those. Now, last week in part 1, I suggested that verse 1 of Genesis 18 that nothing really happens in verse 1, but it's a summary of what's about to happen in the story. Verse 1 says, "And Adonai appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. He was sitting at the doorway of the tent in the heat of the day." So Abraham was sitting in the doorway of the tent, and Adonai appeared to him. And so what you would expect after that verse is in the next verse, it's going to say, "And Adonai said to him," or "And Adonai was in the clouds, and there were angels," but there's nothing like that. Actually, what the next verse says is, "He lifted his eyes and saw that, behold, 3 men were standing across from him." So the Lord appeared to him, but what he sees are 3 men standing across from him in the desert, and he's in the doorway of the tent. Now, how do we understand that? Is verse 1 a story that's never finished, and the Lord appeared to him, but we never find out anything about what the Lord said? Or is it a summary statement and this long story that we're translating about 3 visitors and Abraham preparing a meal for them and Sarah laughing, and the Lord suddenly speaks up and says he's going to return this time next year and he's going to surely give Sarah a son? Is it that the 3 visitors are the fulfillment of this Adonai appeared to him? And that's, of course, what I think and what I suggested is the case last week. Well, now, here in part 2 of our translation of Genesis 18, we're going to begin to see that fulfilled. We're going to begin to see how the Lord shows up in the story. But as I hinted at the beginning, in the Hebrew, it's not clear that one of the visitors is the Lord until verse 13. Some English translations jump the gun and say the Lord earlier than that. Well, let's start reading in Genesis 18:9. Vayomru elav, Aye Sarah ishtecha, Vayomer hine vaohev. Vayomer shuv ashuv elecha, ka'et chaya, vehine vein l'Sarah ishtecha, v'Sarah shoma'at petach ha'ohel, v'hu acharav. Verse 11. V'Avraham v'Sarah zakenim, ba'im bayamim, chadal lihyot l'Sarah orach ka nashim. Verse 12. Vatitzchak Sarah b'kirba lemor, acharei viloti haitali edna va'adoni zaken. Verse 13. Vayomer Adonai el Avraham, lama ze sachaka Sarah lemor ha'af umnam elech ba'ani zakanti. Hagipale, verse 14. Hagipale me Adonai davar, la moed ashuv elecha ka'et chaya, ul Sarah ven. Verse 15. V'techachesh Sarah lemor, lo tzachachti, ki yareya. Vayomer, lo, ki zachachta. Vayakumu misham, and then finally verse 16. Vayakumu misham ha'anashim, vayashkifu al penei Sodom, va'Avraham holech imam le'shalcham. Okay, let's break that down a little bit at a time. Verse 9. Vayomru. So this is a vav conversive. That va in front converts an imperfect into a past tense. And we see the signal letters yod at the beginning and u or shurek at the end. That tells us it's the they form. And they did something. They amar, they said. And they said, who's the they? It's the 3 visitors. And they said elav. El means unto, and that vav ending means him. And they said unto him. You know, the vav ending that means him or his, it can appear in a number of different forms. It can be a cholam vav sometimes, o, or sometimes it can just be a consonantal vav like we have here. But if you have the suffix vav after a noun or a preposition, it means him or his. Okay, vayomru elav, and they said unto him, Aye Sarah ishtecha. Now, aye, if you look it up in the dictionary, the one I recommend is Holiday, H-O-L-L-A-D-A-Y, a concise Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. It's cheap, affordable, super easy to use. compact. If you look up aye, you'll see it means where. This is a question word. Where? Aye Sarah. Where is Sarah? You say, where's the is in there? It's just aye Sarah, which is literally where Sarah. In Hebrew, you don't have to write the simple verb to be. It's just understood. So when you say where Sarah, you're saying where is Sarah? Ishtecha. Now, ishtecha is the word wife, isha, but the final hey disappears and is replaced by a tav, and the cha ending means your. So ishtecha is your wife. Now, whenever you put a suffix on a noun, the noun changes to its construct form or its word pair form. So isha means wife, eshet means wife of. And so really what we're doing here is we're putting cha on the end of eshet. But when you put cha on the end of eshet, it changes the vowels a little bit. So it's not eshetecha, it's just ishtecha. These changes that happen to nouns in Hebrew when you put prefixes and suffixes on them, you get used to them. Your wife. Where is Sarah, your wife? Vayomer. Okay, so first we had multiple, and they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? Now it just says, Vayomer. You see, in the Hebrew Bible, you don't have a lot of punctuation. And so what's happening here is we've got a change of speaker. The three visitors were speaking, and now Abraham's going to speak. And the way biblical narrative handles that, it just has another verb. This time the verb is singular. And he said. They said, now he said. And you, as the reader, have to figure out who the they and the he are, just from common sense. So the they were the three visitors. The he is Abraham answering their question. Vayomer, hine vaohed. Hine is behold. And you're probably used to this. In Hebrew, if you just say behold, it's a way of pointing something out in the story. Behold, she's in the tent. I don't know if people really spoke that way. I guess they did. But that's the way it's told in the narrative. Behold, she's in the tent. Okay. Or literally, he just says, behold, in the tent. Now verse 10. Vayomer. Okay, so here we have another, and he said. This is going to be a different person. So first, they said to Abraham, and that was the three visitors, and Abraham answered their questions. And then it says, and he said. Now, who's the he here? It's probably one of the three visitors. Now, by the way, the English Standard Version, the ESV, and maybe some other translations jump the gun here. And they say, and the Lord said. Well, you know, the Lord isn't in the text. It just says, Vayomer. There's no Adonai after it. So what they're doing is they're interpreting and trying to make it a little easier for the reader to understand the story. But you know, the story is told with some suspense. One of the questions you should be asking yourself when you read this story is, does Abraham realize who his visitors are? And can we as the reader be sure who Abraham's visitors are? Where does that become apparent? Now, let's just jump ahead for a minute, because I don't want you to think I'm just making this up. Look at verse 13. Now in verse 13, it says, Vayomer Adonai el Avraham. And Adonai said unto Abraham. And the Lord said unto Abraham. So we are going to see the Lord introduced as a specific character in this story in verse 13. But he hasn't been introduced yet. And we don't know exactly when Abraham figured out that one of these three visitors was God or a spokesman for God. However, I think we're going to see it happen in verse 10, because look what the person says in verse 10. So picture Abraham. He's had these three visitors come. He's gone to Sarah and said, let's prepare this meal for them. He stood under the tree and watched them eat this meal. And now they're having the post-meal discussion. And as they have the discussion, listen to what one of the visitors says. Vayomer, Shuv Ashuv. That, by the way, means, surely I will return elecha unto you ka'et chaya, when the season comes again. I'll explain the Hebrew of all of that for a minute. But why would a visitor to Abraham say, surely I will return to you next year when it's the season again. Why would he say that? Why? I mean, as far as we know, there's not been a clear indication that Abraham knows who this visitor is. And he's going to go on to say, and behold, there will be a son to Sarah, your wife. So I think it's at this point that Abraham can tell that one of the visitors is in fact God, or at least is speaking for God. But now let's do the Hebrew for verse 10. It's some challenging Hebrew. Vayomer shov ashuv. I probably pronounced that wrong every time I read it. I'm so used to seeing shuv, but it's shov ashuv. Okay, so if you look up shov, the root is shin vav bet. And the only use of this root that's spelled this way, shov, is the infinitive. It's the infinitive absolute. All right? I'll explain what an infinitive absolute is in just a minute, but let's look at the next word because these two words go together. Ashuv. Now it's a little easier to see what ashuv is. This is an imperfect. That is a prefix form of the verb. The verb is actually shin vav bet. But look at that aleph prefix. When you have an aleph prefix on a verb, it means I will. And shuv means return. So what this literally says, and he said, returning, I will return. Returning, I will return. Why would he say it that way? Well, it's a Hebrew idiom, and it means I will surely return, or I will indeed return. This is a curious Hebrew way of saying things in a very emphatic manner. So this speaker, whose identity has not been revealed yet, is promising to return next year. Shov ashuv, surely I will return, elecha, unto you. El unto cha, you. Ka, eight, chaya. All right, 8 means a season or a time of, like a time. It could be a time of the year or a time of the day, but here he's probably talking about a time of the year. Ka, 8. Now what's ka? Ka usually means like or as, but sometimes it can mean about, like approximating something. So he could be saying, surely I will return to you about when the season chaya, chaya. Chaya comes from the verb for living or to be alive. And it also has a sense of renews or revives. So how does a season renew or revive? Well, if he came in the springtime, he means when spring comes again. When spring revives or when summer revives. He's saying he's going to come back to him in the following year at the same time. So surely I will return unto you at the time. I think my official translation was, oh no, when the season comes again. Could be at the time of the season coming again, or when the season comes again. Vahine, and behold, then l'Sarah, a son will be to Sarah. Now, where's the will be? Well, again, the simple verb is, was, will be, doesn't have to be used in the Hebrew. It's just understood. Literally, it's a son for Sarah, Ishtecha, your wife. But the meaning is a son will be to Sarah, your wife. Now, what's Sarah doing while all this is happening? The Sarah shoma'at, and Sarah was listening. So shoma'at is the participle form, and you can always tell a participle in Hebrew because it has an O class vowel over the first root letters. So the root is shin, mem, ayin. And shoma'at, you have an O class vowel over the first root letter. Now, the singular would be the masculine participle would be shomea. The feminine is shoma'at. The masculine plural would be shom'im. The feminine plural would be shom'ot. So it's about Sarah, who is obviously a female, and she's singular. So it uses the form shoma'at. Sarah was listening. Okay. When a participle is used as a verb, it's usually an ing form of the verb. But how did I get past tense? Was listening. Well, you know, just from the context of the story. While the guy is speaking, Sarah was listening. That seems to be the idea. Okay, Vasara shoma'at petach ha'ohel, the doorway of the tent. Petach means doorway or entrance. Ha means the, ohel means tent. So there seems to be a preposition missing here. You would expect it to say, Sarah shoma'at me patach ha'ohel, from the entranceway of the tent. But for some reason, there's no preposition. I recommend, though, you put one in your translation because no one will understand it if you don't. Vahu acharav. Vahu acharav. Vahu, and he, acharav, was behind. And it was behind him. Excuse me. The who here probably means it, meaning the tent. The tent was behind him. So picture you got a tent, and you got Sarah standing in the door, and you got the three visitors sitting here talking to Abraham, who's probably over here. So their backs are to the tent where Sarah is standing, so that they can't see Sarah. But Sarah was listening. You kind of get the idea that usually a woman wouldn't be listening while the men are talking, or that a woman's not really exactly a part of the discussion. So theoretically, these three visitors are unaware of Sarah because the tent that she's standing in is behind them. But that's going to play into the next verse. And this is going to be part of how it becomes clear that the person who's speaking is in fact God. Okay, the next verse. Verse 11. Va'avraham v'Sarah zekenim. And Abraham and Sarah were old. Okay, so zekenim is an adjective, and it's plural because it's describing Abraham and Sarah. And in Hebrew, adjectives, if the subject of the adjective is plural, then the adjective has to be plural. And notice that, again, there's no is, but it doesn't make sense if you don't supply a form of the to be. Abraham and Sarah old. So you have to supply the were, because the simple form of is, was, will be, were, that's not usually written out in Hebrew. So Abraham and Sarah were old. Ba'im ba'yamin. Okay. Ba'im is a participle from the root bo, which is bet vav aleph. And we call a verb like bo, we call it a hollow verb, because what typically happens in a hollow verb, here are your three root letters. Okay, we got bet, vav, aleph. If you have vav or yod as a middle letter of a verb, it disappears in most of the forms of the verb. So there are a good number of verbs with vav or yod in the middle that are pretty common in Hebrew. Bo is one of the most common verbs in the entire Hebrew Bible. So anytime you see a bet and an aleph in a verb, it's probably bo. And that vav in the middle is going to drop out sometimes. Now, what else do we notice about this? Not only is it ba'im, well, we have that im ending on. What kind of verb could have an im ending? A participle. Because participles have four forms. It would be ba, bat, ba'im, ba'ot would be the four forms of the participle. So this is the plural form because it's still talking about Abraham and Sarah, a plural subject. Now, bo means come, to come, or sometimes it kind of has a sense more of to go, a little bit like halach. So they are coming or going by yamim, in days. What does that mean? Well, this is a part of a description about how old they are. So literally it's, and Abraham and Sarah were old, coming in days, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So you want to try to render it a little better than that. Most people would say getting along in years. Now, we say getting along in years in English. That's our expression. Maybe their expression was more about days than years, but it means the same thing. So you could translate this getting along in days or getting along in years, advancing in years, something like that. Chadal, ceased. That is the verb that means ceased. Ceased, lihyot, to be. All right, lihyot is a little bit hard to figure out if you don't just know it. How would you figure out lihyot? It's an infinitive, so that lamed means to, and then you just have hyot. Whenever you have an ot ending on a verb, it was probably originally a hey. So your root letters would have been hey, yod, hey, which is haya, which is the verb for being. And so lihyot means to be. So the hard thing when you're looking at lihyot is to figure out that the root is hey, yod, hey. One thing that could help is if you just started off assuming that the hey and the yod are part of the root. And if you open the dictionary and start looking under hey and yod, it might occur to you as you look through the entries, oh, maybe that third root letter was a hey. And if you did think that, you would see lihyot spelled under the heading for haya, and it means to be. Ceased to be, l'Sarah, for Sarah, orach means way, like a path or a way, almost like a road. This is one of the many synonyms for paths or roads in the Bible. Ceased to be for Sarah, the way of nashim, women. All right, but it says ka nashim. Why is the ka there? Ka is like, as, or about. So, it seems like it might not need to be there. Like you could just say orach nashim, the way of women. But the ka, let me see, I'm not exactly sure why the ka is there. I'm not seeing what function it's performing in the sentence. Oh, I got it. It's actually listed in holiday. I struggled over this when I was preparing for class. So in holiday, if you look up kaf, the preposition kaf, it says one of the meanings of it is suitable to. Okay, so if we try to render this literally, it would be cease to be for Sarah the way suitable to women. And that the ka kind of here means suitable to. So ka is a really weird preposition. It usually means like or as, but we saw a little while ago it can mean approximately, and now we see it can even mean suitable to. It's got a lot of different possible meanings. All right. So Sarah basically was too old to have children, is what this is saying. Then verse 12 is going to pick up on that theme. Vatitzchak Sarah b'kirba. Now remember, the three visitors are facing Abraham, and Sarah's behind them. She hasn't said anything out loud. Now in verse 13, oh no, verse 12, Vatitzchak Sarah, and Sarah laughed. Okay, you might think, oh boy, that's how they knew. She laughed. They heard her laugh. Well, look at the next word, b'kirba, in her inner self. All right, ba in, kerev, inner, ba of her, in the innards of her. She laughed in her innards. She laughed inside of herself. So she's not laughing out loud. She's just kind of inside her mind, she's laughing. Now that's important because of what's about to happen. Lemor, achare veloti. Achare means after. Veloti, you'll find these consonants in the dictionary. It means without. After, without, hayata, being, li, for me, edna, sexual pleasure. Holiday lists the only meaning of this as sexual pleasure. Ba'adoni zakein, and my Lord is old. Okay, so how do I translate that? And Sarah laughed within herself, thinking, after I am no more, will there be to me sexual pleasure? Okay. And my Lord is old. So I took it as a question, saying, after there is not for me sexual pleasure, and my Lord is old. It doesn't necessarily have to be a question. I'm not sure why I took it as a question before. It's not clearly a question, so you could write it as a statement. And Sarah laughed within herself, thinking, "What? After I am without being, after there is without being for me sexual pleasure." Just so you know, some people think that edna doesn't mean sexual pleasure, but means conception, the ability to conceive children. And I don't know where they get their evidence. Holiday listed only sexual pleasure as the meaning here. And my master is old. So this is what Sarah is thinking to herself. And remember, the three visitors are facing Abraham, and the tent is behind them. That's where Sarah is, so they don't see Sarah. And remember, Sarah laughed inside herself, and she had this thought in her head. She didn't say it out loud. Now look what happens in verse 13. Verse 13 is the key verse. Vayomer Adonai el Avraham. Now the Lord speaks. Now let's just pause for a minute and think, how do we understand this? One way to understand it would be, you've got three visitors talking to Abraham, and Sarah in the tent are behind them, and all of a sudden the Lord speaks from heaven, and they hear a heavenly voice. That's one way you could understand the story. Or you could assume that since there has been this person already who's been speaking to Abraham, who said, "Surely I will return to you at this season next year, and there will be a son for Sarah, your wife." Since someone's already been kind of speaking like the Lord, it makes sense now in verse 13 that the narrator just comes right out and says, okay, one of the three visitors is the Lord. It's strange, though, isn't it? Unless you remember what was said back in verse 1, and the Lord appeared unto Abraham at the oaks of Mamre. And now we see he did indeed appear to Abraham. He was one of the three visitors. And he gets outed in verse 13. So as a reader, you're supposed to not know that until you get to this point of the story. You probably thought it was strange in verse 10 that one of the strangers was saying, "I will return to you, and Sarah will have a son." Like, who in the world is that? But now we find out explicitly who it is. And Adonai, or the Lord, said, El Abraham, unto Abraham, Lama ze. Right? Lama means why, and ze usually means this. Why this? So I thought to myself, that doesn't make sense. Why does it say Lama ze? So I looked it up, and what most scholars think, when you put ze, it's a way of strengthening it. So it's kind of like saying, why on earth? So lama by itself would just mean why, but if you put ze after it, it's a stronger kind of like, why in the world? Why on earth? So I went on ahead and translated it that way. Why on earth? Sachaka, Sarah. All right. Sachak is the root for laugh. Sachaka is the feminine form. So it means she laughed. Why on earth laughed Sarah? Why on earth did Sarah laugh? Lemor, saying. Now, before I read what comes after Lemor, saying, let me ask you, did Sarah say anything? Only in her head did she say something. All right? But let's see what the Lord says that Sarah said. Ha'af umnam eled va'ani zakanti. I think when I read it before, I said elech instead of eled. My apologies. It's eled. Okay. Ha'af. Now, I was familiar with af meaning nose or anger. So I was confused at first. And I had to look it up in Holiday myself. I was unaware of the fact that af is a word that has two completely unrelated meanings. On the one hand, af can mean nose or anger, but on the other hand, it means even or indeed. Okay? What's the ha in front of it? You might think that ha is the, but you can't say the indeed or the even. That wouldn't make any sense. That ha is not the word the. This is the question word hey, the interrogative hey. Okay? It tells you that something is a question. Another way you can tell that this is the interrogative or question word hey is by the vowel that's underneath it. Usually, if you put ha in front of an aleph is a guttural, there would have to be a comates or a T-shaped vowel under the hey. But instead, we only have patach or a dash-shaped vowel under the hey. And when does ha have a shorter vowel? When it's the question word hey. Okay? So the fact that this doesn't have a comates but a patach, and there's no dagesh in the aleph, tells you that this is the question word hey. So it's asking something like, will indeed. Okay? Umanam. What in the world is umanam? Well, I found out. You can look up umanam, just like it's spelled here, and it's listed, and it means really. Will indeed really, or will indeed in truth. It's related to the root amen, which has to do with believing something or something being true. Will indeed truly, Eled, I bear a child. Okay, how in the world does Eled mean I bear a child? Okay, so this is what we call a drop letter imperfect. So when you look at Eled, the aleph is actually the prefix, and it means I will. And then we only have two root letters left, which are Lamed and Dalet. So a letter dropped out. So many times the letter that drops out of a verb is the first letter. And I've been using the name for that, the drop letter imperfect, because in my favorite textbook on Hebrew, the first Hebrew primer, she likes to give easy names to things so the students can remember them in the future. I really like how she teaches Hebrew. She calls it the drop letter imperfect because when the prefix aleph comes up on this verb, yod, lamed, dalet, the first letter drops out. And that's what we have, eled. Now, how did I know there was a yod there? Well, when the letter drops out from the first position of a verb, it's usually yod or nun. Now, I always tell my students, try yod and nun first, but here's an easy way to remember all of the letters that tend to drop out at the beginning of a drop letter imperfect. Vanilla. If you spell vanilla in Hebrew, it would be vav, nun, yod, lamed, hey. Vav, nun, yod, lamed, hey. Those are the letters that drop out at the beginning of a verb. And here the yod has dropped out. So we put the aleph here, the yod drops out, and you end up with eled. What does yalad mean? To bear a child. What does eled mean? I will bear a child. Will indeed I truly bear a child? Va'ani zachanti, and I am old. The I is kind of in there twice because kanti by itself already means I am old or I was old. The T suffix after the zakan, this is a perfect, all by itself zakanti would mean I was old. But sometimes a perfect has a present sense, and the present sense fits the context here a lot better. And I am old. Okay, so the person who's actually speaking is Adonai. And Adonai is saying what Sarah was thinking in her head. And he's not done. Adonai is still speaking in verse 14. But before we go any further, how does this person who's speaking know that Sarah laughed and know what Sarah was thinking? Because it's Adonai. And Adonai knows what we're thinking. So, you know, as a reader, you're supposed to be experiencing that in this story. Abraham saw 3 visitors in the desert. He showed them this great hospitality and fed them this incredible meal. And it turns out one of them was the Lord. Now, I realize I should not give away the suspense. I think I already started to give away the suspense last week anyway. The other 2 are going to turn out to be angels. And what we're going to see is the other 2 are going to go on to Sodom and Gomorrah. And in chapter 19, those are going to be the 2 angels who go to see Lot. What's the 3rd visitor doing while the other 2 visitors go to Sodom? He's walking with Abraham, and they're having a discussion about justice. We're going to get into that in part 3 and part 4 of translating this chapter. But now, for now, let's do verse 14. Verse 14 is a pretty amazing verse too. Hayipale me Adonai davar la moed ashuv elecha ka'et chaya u'lesara vein. Okay, the first part of the sentence, just a little bit difficult to translate, a little bit challenging. Hayipale. Now, cover up the ha for a minute and just look at yipale. This is an imperfect verb. The root is pe lamed aleph, and it means difficult, for something to be difficult. Okay. Now look at the ha. Notice that the ha has the very short vowel under it. It has the patach shava, or the chataf patach. That's the patach with the shava next to it. When do you have ha with a shortened vowel? When it's the question word he, or the interrogative he. So this is a question. Yipale, difficult, me Adonai, from Adonai. Davar is a thing. That's a kind of a strange way of saying, can a thing be too difficult for Adonai? You know, literally it's something like, will it be difficult from Adonai a thing? The idea is basically, is there anything that's hard for Adonai? And then it goes on to say, La moed, at the appointed time, Ashuv, I will return. We translated Ashuv in an earlier verse. It's an imperfect. I will return, Elecha, unto you, Ka'et Chaya, when the season revives, or when the season comes again. Ula Sarah, and to Sarah, vain, a son, will be a son. So he's repeating what he said earlier. So the idea that one of the visitors is in fact the Lord is clear here. And he could hear what Sarah was thinking. He heard her laugh in her head. He knew what she was thinking to herself. And he corrected her. Nothing is too difficult for Adonai. Now, look what Sarah does in response. I thought verse 15 was kind of amazing and true to life. Vat chachesh Sarah. I didn't know what in the world kachesh was. I had to look it up. It's a PL verb, and it means denied. So, and Sarah denied it. Wow. That's pretty strong. God's standing right there. And Lemor saying, Lo tzachakti. I did not laugh. And Sarah denied it, saying, I did not laugh. Ki yareya, for she was afraid. Now, it's a little confusing when you're translating Hebrew, because the Hebrew Bible doesn't put quotation marks around the speech, the words of the characters. And so when I was translating this at first, I didn't grasp that it was no longer Sarah speaking. Now it's back to the narrator explaining the story to us. So once we get to the key, we're back to the narrator. And the narrator says, for she was afraid. Let's look at Yareya for a minute. All right, that's the root Yod, Resh, Aleph. And the ending is the feminine ending for a past tense or a perfect verb. So it's literally, for she was afraid. Ki, for Yareya, she was afraid. Vayomer, and he said. Now, who is the he? It's Adonai, who was just speaking in the previous verse. So Sarah denies it and says, I did not laugh. She said that because she was afraid. And then we read Vayomer. And so now the he said is coming back, and the he is Adonai. And what does he say? Lo, ki zakakta. No, but you did laugh. Now, this is the thing that I said at the beginning that I just kind of breezed over all the many times I've read this story in English. How the Lord in this story doesn't let Sarah off the hook. So Sarah, she just laughed in her head. She didn't laugh out loud. So in a way, what Sarah is saying is true. You know, she could say, no, I didn't laugh, because she laughed in her head. I mean, think about it. If you were accused of laughing at someone who was offended because you laughed, but you knew that you only laughed in your head, you would probably deny it, just like Sarah is doing right here. But see, you can't deny it to Adonai. He even knows what you're thinking. You know, sometimes, you know, someone might accuse you of laughing because they could see the look on your face. You know, maybe you roll your eyes or something like that, and you're like, oh, I wasn't laughing. But they could tell what you were thinking inside because you showed it with your expression. But here, it's not even that. She was behind this visitor. He wasn't even looking at her, and she was just thinking it in her head. And he knew that she was there, and he knew what she was thinking. It's pretty amazing. And he doesn't let her off the hook. She denies it, but he says, no, but you did laugh. He's holding her accountable for it. And then we come to the last verse for tonight, 16. So we did make it through all the verses. Okay, good. Vayakumu misham. And they rose up from there. So let's look at Vayakumu. Va makes it a vav conversive, so it's going to be in the past tense. Yakumu, the ya, the yod at the beginning is the prefix. The u or shurek at the end is the suffix. That means they did something. Here's what we're left with for the root, kof and mem. So this is another example of a hollow verb. And the letter in the middle is a vav. And it has dropped out, which is why we've got this strange vowel, kibbutz, which is pronounced u here. Because usually the vav is pronounced u. And since it's what dropped out, the vowel that remains is still an u sound. It's just the shorter u sound. The vayakumu misham. And they arose from there, ha'anashim, the men. And the men rose from there. Vayashkifu. This is a hifil verb, which you don't have to just be able to look at a verb and tell that it's a hifil. You can always look it up in the dictionary and use the definition to help you see where this spelling occurs. Now, but if you want to know how you can tell it's a hifil, it's because there'll usually be an E sound on the second root letter. A lot of times there's a yod. There's no yod here. It can be written with or without the yod, but it's still going to have that E or that chirek vowel underneath it, under the second root letter. That's one of the signs of the hifil. That's why it's called hifil by yashkifu. So the root is shin, kof, pei, and it means to look down. And they looked down all on Panay, the face of Sodom. I thought to myself, what does it mean they looked down on the face of Sodom? Well, you know, the theory is that Sodom was pretty close to the Dead Sea. And if you've ever been to the Dead Sea, it's the lowest place on earth, 1,300 feet below sea level. And it's very flat. It's a plain. But around it, there are mountains. So, you know, if you're, let's see, Abraham was at the Oaks of Mamre. I don't know if we know where the Oaks of Mamre were, what town they were in. But there are many places on a clear day you can look down and see the Dead Sea from, because it's the low spot, and if you're on a hill, you can look down into the valley. So probably what it means is, and they look down on the plain of Sodom, or the valley of Sodom. But in a literal sense, it's the face of Sodom. But Avraham holech, and Abraham was going, imam, with them, l'shalcham, to send them. I guess that's a politeness thing. When your visitors are leaving, that you would walk part of the way with them to see them off or to send them off. I think in English we would usually say to see them off. So in our story tonight, the theophany aspect of things is three very ordinary looking men, as far as we can tell, visited Abraham. And Abraham discovers that one of them is in fact the Lord. Now, I looked at art on Google. I Googled this story, the three visitors to Abraham. And most of the art that people have made about this story, they will show two of the visitors having angels' wings. Now, that's very fanciful. There's no indication in the story that these visitors looked like anyone out of the ordinary. And it doesn't call them angels. It doesn't suggest that they had wings or something like that. So, a lot of times the artists who paint a story are interpreting it incorrectly. Really what happened, and I think this is really amazing, is two angels and God appeared to Abraham like ordinary human beings. And it was what they said and what they knew that revealed to Abraham who they were. And part of what led me to want to look into Theophanies in the first place was just to understand, how does God appear to people on earth? And one of the ways it happens, he appears in human form. To me, that's an interesting point because, of course, I believe in Yeshua, and I believe that Yeshua was the divine Messiah. Now, people will ask me, a number of people have emailed me and asked me, do I think that this man who appeared to Abraham was Yeshua? No, it's not that simple. All right, Yeshua is when God entered into the womb of a woman and was born as a man. It was divinity joined to humanity. This wasn't that. This is God appearing in human form. So he looked and apparently could eat like a human, but it doesn't necessarily mean God had become an actual man. But I still find it interesting because people who argue from a Jewish point of view that Jesus or Yeshua could not really be divine because God would never appear in the form of a man. Sometimes they'll quote verses from the Bible. Am I a man that I should lie or change my mind? Numbers 24:19. They're misusing those verses. God had appeared. In Genesis 3, he was walking in the garden, producing thunder. And here to Abraham, he appears as one of three apparently ordinary-looking men. But what was not ordinary was what this man could know and how this man spoke. That's what revealed him to be divine. Now, we're going to see later in the story, Abraham understands who this man is. He walks with him and has a discussion with him about justice. And he's going to call him by a title. He calls him the judge of all the earth. Abraham got who these visitors were. So I hope as you read the story, you'll see it clearly too, and that it will cause you to think about the ways God appears to humans on earth. Meanwhile, what are we going to do next week? We're going to do Genesis 18, 17 through 25. Verses 17 through 25 next week. It'll be part 3 of our story. I hope you enjoyed the broadcast tonight. Again, this is Derek Leman for Holy Language Institute, and I'll look forward to seeing you for many more classes on the subject of Theophanies in the Hebrew Bible.